Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello and welcome to episode 146. How are you all doing? I am definitely back in my office, back in the swing of things. I'd forgotten what it's like to exist in a well-insulated place, and my office is about 18 months old and my house is about 300 years old. And it's quite the difference between modern day proper insulation and bare brick walls with dodgy plaster. And so every time I come in here, I'm boiling, actually boiling. The radiator comes on for half an hour in the morning. I don't really know why, because I feel like it should, because it's an outside, it's in the garden. But probably that's overkill. I've been watching, did anybody watch the Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock that was, years ago? I should Google. I should be a good podcaster and Google when exactly came out. But my eldest son, Ned, you may know him from previous episode, is he read all the Sherlock Holmes. He's very into it. He's very, as you might have guessed, he's into spooky stuff. He gets it from his mother. But he's at that age where some things can be too spooky. But Sherlock Holmes really hit the sweet spot for him. And so, I like the Basil Rathbone Sherlock, but I feel that probably, perhaps we're going to be the last generation that really appreciates that kind of acting. But we thought we'd give the Benedict Cumberbatch one a go. It's bloody weird, isn't it? It's quite good. My husband is reading The Hobbit to the other kids, and I said, I've never seen the film. We should watch the film. And he was like, I cannot do 3 films of Martin Freeman. I find 1 hour of him in Sherlock quite enough. I think he's very good. But yeah, have you seen them? They're quite watchable. It's quite good. Mid-range, spooky, creepy, nothing too gory, nothing too inappropriate. I'm trying to think if there was anything to it. Like, stuff that is inappropriate still goes over his head, if you know what I mean. Certain drug references or sex references or whatever, they still go over his head, but there's nothing too graphic in nature. So yeah, I had completely forgotten they existed until he appeared and was like, oh, there's been a recent Sherlock we should watch. So that's what we've been doing. It is officially spooky season. That's just reminded me I need to take my eldest to Sainsbury's. Last year we went to HomeSense. There was Halloween stuff everywhere. I then took them in the autumn half term before Halloween to go and pick some Halloween stuff. And they'd got rid of all the Halloween stuff and put out all the Christmas stuff. So not only were my children psychologically scarred by having, for weeks, badgered me to go to HomeSense to get the Halloween stuff, and I'd made them wait. But they also, and then there was nothing there. They also then had to deal with the fact that their mother went on this massive, which is, to be fair, an annual rant that they have thus far just not been in the room for. Halloween stuff. I remember once Halloween was midweek, and I went to Sainsbury's the day before Halloween to get some trick-or-treat stuff, all gone. And I was a bit like, surely, what you've done there, this was pre-kids in Chiswick Sainsbury's, to some poor guy who just wanted to get on with his daily life as a Sainsbury's worker. I was like, what? So you've actively taken Halloween stuff off the shelves that you could have been selling to me now. It doesn't seem sensible. It makes me so angry. I want to be able to buy Halloween stuff on the day. Surely it makes no difference to you as a shop. You want to sell as much of that as possible. Absolutely furious. I do it about Easter as well. I went into, so it's getting slightly ranty now, aren't I? I went into our local mini Tesco's, what they call Tesco Express. This is very niche British, isn't it? Went to Tesco Express, I think like 4 days before Easter. a couple of days before that, it had been lined with Easter eggs on the top of the stands. Easter eggs as far as the eye could see. And then suddenly, a couple of days before Easter, nothing. All gone. And I was like, they haven't all been bought. Someone has gone and taken these down. And surely, I'd say Easter Monday, one of the quietest times for Tesco. In the UK, we have a bank holiday Monday after Easter Day. Originally called Easter Monday, just to clarify. And surely you're still going to have people working that day. Give them something to do on a quiet day. Then take down the Easter stuff. Why do it before? Mind blown. I don't even know how we got there. Oh yeah, it's spooky season. So really, I will try and come up with something spooky for next week. But today is definitely not spooky. Today is not true crime either. It's just a horrible thing that happened. You are welcome. Today we're going to talk about the Hyatt Regency Skywalk collapse. My sources for today's episode are a KMBC9 chronicle, the Skywalk tapes on YouTube, which is pretty harrowing watching, Wikipedia, Kansas newspaper articles from the time. There's lots of, as you'll find out, it's very upsetting. They started building the Hyatt Regency in Kansas City, Missouri in May 1978. The Kansas City Star described the national climate in the late 1970s as, quote, high unemployment, inflation and double-digit interest rates that added pressure on builders to win contracts and complete projects swiftly. The Hyatt Regency was a 40-storey building with over 700 rooms in it, part of the Crown Centre complex owned by Hallmark Cards. It was designed to have an impressive multi-storey atrium as its defining feature, with huge glass windows and 3 walkways between the floors that would become known as skywalks, designed to look like they were floating. I believe that the Hyatt hotels at the time, every hotel they built had this sort of wow factor about it, something unusual about it. And this huge atrium that looks very cool, and the skywalks were the wow factor in Kansas City. The hotel originally opened in July 1980. Like everything at the time, the build was fast-tracked. In fact, the roof had partially collapsed during construction. There were so many corners cut and important things missed. The skywalks were steel, glass and concrete crossings connecting the north and south wings of the building on the second, third and fourth floors. Each one was 120 foot long, 37 metres, and weighed around 64,000 pounds. That's 29,000 kilos. So imagine concrete strips of walkway, corridor, with glass side panels and steel rods and bars holding them up. The one on the 4th floor was directly above the one on the 2nd floor, and the one on the 3rd floor ran at a parallel angle. It looked incredibly kind of 70s modern. Of course, I will put photos up on our social media. So I'm quoting from an engineer's website. During construction, an apparent design flaw was identified. The original plan called for 6 steel hanger rods to run directly from the 2nd floor walkway to the ceiling for support. However, the steel manufacturing contractor objected to this design as it required rods to be screw-threaded to hold the 4th floor walkway in place. The contractor identified this as a potential hazard and proposed a new plan: a set of tie rods that connected the 4th floor walkway to the ceiling, and a separate set that connected the 2nd floor walkway to the 4th floor walkway. Meaning that the 2nd floor walkway support was connected to the 4th floor, and the rods were taking a lot more strain than they were ever intended to. This in turn put undue strain on the beam. So I've seen this described as, if you were holding onto a flagpole with your arm, with your hands, and someone else further down is holding onto the flagpole with their hands, the strain on the flagpole is even and sort of distributed in different areas. If you're holding onto the flagpole with your hands and someone else is holding onto your legs, the strain on you is a lot more, obviously, and the strain on that part of the flagpole is a lot more. So what is so incredibly frustrating was the original design was that the second floor would be connected directly to the ceiling. And the people designing the rods that would do this said the rods would likely be damaged during construction when they were put in because they were so tall, and suggested this workaround, which instead of having the tall rods all the way to the ceiling, it had shorter rods to the fourth floor, and then the fourth floor was connected to the ceiling. And this was not checked. This was a suggestion that was then taken as fact. None of the maths was done. Nothing was checked. The fourth floor walkway is about 30 foot above the second. And these walkways are fine. They weren't obviously supposed for high traffic, but how much high traffic do you get at a hotel, people moving between north and south areas on the same floor? However, the Hyatt Regency Hotel often put on tea dances. They wanted to show off this atrium and be part of the community, and it's good for business. Pre-internet, this kind of party and things would draw people to the hotel and to its facilities. Now, on the 17th of July 1981, they were holding a tea dance and over 1,000 people attended. It looks really fun. And there's a band playing, and a mariachi band is due to play, and there are lots of local families there, and they have a really fun time. I believe they'd had a tea dance there before. Now, everyone's mingling around in the atrium. There's a bar in the atrium. It's beautifully lit. It's the summer. It's a lovely time is being had by all. And lots of people have gone onto the walkways to have a good view down into the lobby below where everyone is dancing and the band is playing. And one of the reasons there is the KMBC footage is that it was being televised. A reporter who was a sort of lifestyle reporter at the time had been sent to the tea dance to sort of report on it, film some people dancing, having a good time. So there is actual footage of what happens next. At about 7:05 that evening, everyone hears a big pop and cracking sound, and the fourth floor skywalk drops a couple of feet, and then seconds later it completely crashes through onto the second floor walkway, which in turn cracks and falls into the atrium below. It is these are concrete walkways dropping over 40 feet into an atrium that is filled with over 1,000 people. And it is absolute chaos and carnage. Dr. Joseph F. Wackerly, who'd recently resigned as Kansas City's medical director to take a position at a local hospital, was among one of the first responders on the scene. He said, quote, "You have to understand the chaos and the carnage that had gone on in that lobby. The water was flowing, the mains were cut when the skywalks collapsed, electrical wires were hanging and arcing and sparking. There were no lights." So what has happened is when the skywalks fall, it has triggered the hotel's sprinkler system, which is raining water down into the atrium. The mains water has been switched off, but it doesn't feed the sprinkler system. There's no way of switching off the sprinkler system. And because of this fall of concrete, there is dust everywhere. They've had to switch off the electrics to try and stop, as Dr. Wackley says, the sparking of broken cables, electrocuting people. And so the first responders, that is what they're walking into. One of the first police officer on the scene is Vincent Ortega. I believe that literally someone runs outside and grabs him and takes him in, and he said it was just like a horror movie. When someone grabs you as a policeman, I expect, especially at this time in this place, if he just assumed, someone needs a bit of help. He was not expecting what he walked into. Rich Coble, who was in the band, I believe he was the trombone player in the band that night, said, quote, "It immediately smelled like death. There were people trapped in every which way, people trapped in between the 4th floor and the 2nd floor walkway, people trapped underneath both. It was just horrendous, and almost, I suppose, made worse by the fact that minutes before everyone had been dancing and having fun. And in the film, you can see a couple called Karen Jetta and her husband Eugene. Karen's 37, her husband's 48. They'd gotten married a couple of weeks earlier. Karen's son, Brent Wright, whose father and stepmother were also at the dance but survived, would say, quote, "They had captured this video of my mother and my stepfather dancing, laughing, and just having a great time. It's a really nice thing to know that at least that night they were enjoying themselves and living their lives to the fullest, still newlyweds." They die, as far as we know, instantly. And this is what happens with this skywalk collapse, is that everyone knows someone who is affected by this. It is absolutely devastating. But as with lots of tragedies, the response is worth looking at, because the local response was absolutely phenomenal. Not only did we have first responders, you had EMS units, members of the fire brigade, doctors from 5 local hospitals. But when these people arrived, they found a 60-ton pile of steel, concrete and glass encasing the victims. And there was no way. The firemen could only move so much. The fire brigade came. I always get told off by my friend for calling them firemen. The firefighters could only move so much, even with all their equipment. And the locals were like, "What do you need?" Whatever you needed, they got. So local building companies bought their cranes, bought their diggers. Nobody questioned it. Nobody refused. Everything that was needed was bought, so that people bought machines to break the glass windows of the atriums to get in the arm of the crane to lift concrete blocks off people. Nobody filed for return of their things. Nobody sent in an invoice saying, I lost my whatever it was. It was all just people being incredible, and it was a community thing, and it wasn't just something terrible's happened and we need to get together as a community. The situation was absolutely horrendous, because a lot of people had been smashed apart in this, and a lot of times first responders were having to dismember the dead to get to the living. And so these untrained locals, and it's definitely a lot of the first responders, the EMS, the doctors who were on this scene quit afterwards, had to find new careers because of the trauma they suffered. But there were also everyone of the town coming and being a witness to this, and it is just horrendous. So Dr. Wackerly, he just has to do absolutely horrendous things. He says, quote, "There were times when I looked at someone and I said, I can't get you out. I can't help you. You're going to die. Make your peace with God." And I moved on. He had to amputate a man's leg called Jeff. His leg was pinned. They were unable to save the leg either way. And the fact that the leg was pinned onto concrete meant that Jeff was not able to get the medical attention he needed for his other injuries. Dr. Wackerly had to amputate the leg on the scene with a chainsaw that someone had provided, whilst other people had to watch and help. Unfortunately, Jeff would later die in hospital from his injuries, but it was that was the level of severity that they were dealing with. The youngest victim was 11-year-old Pam Kofi. She was crying. She was next to a man. She was next to a man whose legs had been dislocated so that one ankle was behind his head. And he could hear her crying for her father. And he said she had been next to her father and she was crying because she was worried that her father was hurt. And this man said, I saw your father walk away. He's absolutely fine. And he said, I know that he wasn't fine, but that's what she was concerned about. He said, we talked, we prayed together. I comforted her that her father had got out. And then eventually she went quiet. And that was the youngest victim, Pam Kofi. Dalton Grant was 11 and he asked his mother if they were going to die. They were both trapped next to each other. And she said, quote, "I don't know, but if we do, we'll go to a better place." He's eventually pulled out. He's one of the last to be pulled out. He gets pulled out at 2 a.m. So this happens at 7. He gets pulled out at 2 a.m. and he said the whole place went quiet. And then everyone applauded as he got pulled out. And he says, quote, "because they were pulling a little bit of life out of a whole lot of death." Mark Williams is the last survivor to be pulled out alive by firefighter Ray Wynn. And they had to use, what are they called? Those drills, basically, to drill away the concrete around him. And he said, I thought, I've survived this far and they're going to drill through me. He said, they were literally going round his body. And he was just shouting, "Get me out of here, get me out of here." And Ray Wynn, the firefighter who pulled him out, gave him a framed picture of him being pulled out by Wynn. And it says on the plaque at the bottom, "Sorry it took us so long to get you out." Cliff Skurlock, who is one-time drummer of the Flaming Lips, his mother died in the disaster and he got his musical talent from her. She was there playing with the Mariachi Estrella band where all but one member died in the disaster. It was so far-reaching. Joe Wackerly said, quote, "It took me 6 months, both personally and professionally, to get a handle on that situation." And counselling wasn't mandatory. You could go if you wanted, but it obviously wasn't a thing back then. Now you'd absolutely be sent for counselling, I would hope. But as I said earlier, lots of people just couldn't continue with their work after seeing this horrendous disaster. And Vincent Ortega, the first policeman on the scene, said he couldn't get the smell of death, blood and booze out of his nose for months. He said he used to put Vicks vapor rub up his nose and anything he could, and he just couldn't get rid of the smell. It was so horrendous. And he said, as soon as you walked in, you can smell death. And he knew, and I think just absolutely shocking. So, of course, this was all looked into as to why this happened and how this was allowed to happen. And it had quite an interesting outcome. Everything was fast-tracked. We spoke about the cables earlier, the metal rods, that, nobody checked this. And I've seen lots of places where it says nobody was willing to take responsibility. And it's like, for mass death, 114 people died and 216 people were injured. Some of them, one lady is a paraplegic from that moment, went to a tea dance, now cannot move below her neck. It is a serious thing that's happened. And so, I am not surprised that people didn't run forward and say it was my mistake. But the thing is, it also wasn't one person's mistake. It was mistake after mistake after mistake. Engineers and firms were found responsible, and they had their licenses revoked. Some even went bankrupt. Compensation claims from the courts awarded victims around $140 million. There's loads of insurance payouts. There were more than 300 civil suits brought. Numerous changes were made to civil engineering and construction in the wake of this disaster. So it was found that a construction worker had died during the build because of some stupid mistake. It was found that the walkways, after they were built, were so unstructurally sound that the builders wouldn't wheel their wheelbarrows over them. They would rather go round. And I think we've all probably seen builders wheeling wheelbarrows up planks of wood 6 stories up. They wouldn't use the walkway. But nobody fed this back to anyone. Nobody said, by the way, that's really unsafe. Nobody checked anything off. Nobody looked at any of the calculations. Nobody double-checked anything. In fact, the rods were made from a design that was actually a sketch. It wasn't an approved design checked by any architects. It was a sketch that the rods were then measured for, and then the company measuring the rods said, this isn't going to work, let's do it like this. And everyone just went, okay, fine. Nobody checked anything. So there was just mistake after mistake after mistake. So Jack Gillam and Dan Duncan, who were, I believe, the architects involved, had their licenses revoked. And Jack Gillam actually spent the rest of his time giving talks and teaching about the mistake. He felt the responsibility, and he actually made sure that this was at the forefront of training and how did this happen and why did this happen. Brent Wright, who is the son of Karen Jeter and stepson of Eugene Jeter, he had, I believe, been working in construction at the time. He went on to train as a lawyer because of this incident, and rather eerily, the office he works in now looks out over the Hyatt Regency, which is now called something else. So lots of people were found to be at fault. There wasn't one thing that was skipped. There were so many little things. The walkways would have collapsed on less than they were carrying anyway. I mean, there were about 40 people on the second floor walkway and about 20 on the fourth. And it was later discovered that they couldn't even hold that. They had beams that had been welded together, and as the weight went on them, the nuts put pressure on where the weld was, and the weld just popped. The original design supported only 60% of the minimum load required by Kansas City building codes. That was before the rods were changed. So even then, it was only 60%. The whole thing, once you get into the engineering of it, you think, my God, this is just It was an accident waiting to happen and no one there to check it. There is a positive on this story, is that a lot of the first responders and professionals working at the disaster said that they learned a lot that night as to how to improve communications. Now, we have training now for people, especially I think probably even more so since 9/11, but how to respond in a disaster. But back then, that nothing like this had happened, and nothing like this equaled it really until the World Trade Centers fell. So Joe Wackerley says, for example, initially we used a bullhorn, and that shorted out very quickly when you get doused with water. So a bullhorn, you have a megaphone basically, but yeah, you get water, there's sprinklers. Some of the survivors nearly drowned because of the water that's falling down. He says, quote, then it was dark and so people yelled and screamed, and then we sort of got organised. He said he used what he'd learned on the Surfside condo collapse later on, telling members, quote, follow command and control, follow communications, never give up hope, and never give up respect for your patients. And he said, it was a place where you had to learn empathy, and it just completely changed the way disasters were managed. So numerous changes were made to civil engineering and construction in the wake of this disaster, and the curriculum for engineering was completely revised, with the focus on social responsibility, adherence to protocol, and good communication. And that was a huge change, because I guess nothing like this had happened before. And a lot of it was like, who can build something cool and quirky? What's the next big thing? What's the next modern thing? What can we do with steel and glass and concrete and all of that? And now it was like, what is your social responsibility? Have all the checks been done? The hotel opens 3 months later. It's called the Sheraton Kansas City at Crown Center now. It's got one walkway supported by pillars. The third floor walkway is still there, but it's now supported by pillars. And yeah, it opened 2.5 months later. And it just was such a horrendous disaster. Watching the documentary is so interesting, because you hear from survivors, you hear from people who were there and who worked in the emergency services, and just to hear some of these people, the situation they were in, so the guy who was next to Pam Kofi, whose ankle was behind his head, I stupidly haven't written down his name, who was told he'd never probably walk again, and he does walk. But he said, and I was nearly drowning. My ankle is up around my head. Both my legs are completely dislocated from my body. I'm trapped. There's death everywhere. And he doesn't say this, but obviously, people are being chainsawed apart to get to other people. People are screaming and dying. And then you've got to worry about drowning because of this sprinkler system. So a lot of people nearly drowned. I will say that I did mention earlier that once the supplies got there, that's another problem. You don't arrive on the scene with enough supplies for this kind of disaster. So initially, they didn't have a lot of supplies, but once they did, the people who were dying were given morphine to ease their pain and hopefully ease their mental anguish as well, because it just deeply unpleasant in every way. And that is the story of the Hyatt Regency Skywalk collapse. I believe that's another one that my sister sent me a link to and was like, you should do this. She always finds the cheeriest things, but it is just so shocking because, I mean, the extremes of the fun tea dance and the atrium, it does look so cool, and it looks like something from a 70s Bond movie, the multi-story atrium, and you think, yeah, I'm going to go and have a cool 70s party there. And then the next minute, it is dark, it is dusty, there is water coming out of a sprinkler system that no one can stop. There is death and destruction everywhere. And I believe the rescue mission took 14 hours. 14 hours. And you know that people like Dr. Joseph Wackley, Vincent Ortega are not going to go home at the end of their shift. That's 14 hours in what must have felt like hell. So sorry about that. Sorry to put you through 45 minutes of talking about what sounds like hell, but it is incredibly interesting. And I do always look for the outcome of this. And the outcome of this is that by the time the next disaster happened, or they had things in place for how to deal with it, and engineering completely changed to understanding what needs to come first. Why were these calculations missed? Who's in charge of that? How do we make sure this doesn't happen? Because now, I mean, I don't know about you, I've had architects do designs for me. And you get the designs, you get them, and you have them signed off. And you have signed off, I mean, I've had to go through planning, and you have to make sure that what you've built is exactly, there are so many checks, and it's an absolute ball ache at the time. But I take it all back. All my moaning, Hammersmith Council, I mean, you're still questionable, but you get this and you're like, oh, okay, this is why all the checks have to be in place, because when they're not done, the disaster is off the scale. The best thing you can do to help this podcast is to like it, review it, subscribe to it, share it with your friends. I really appreciate it. Come over to the Patreon. There's extra content over there, and it's also just a really good way to support the podcast. You can get your Monday Night Review merch as well. I'm currently wearing a Pod Dog t-shirt because they are so soft. I've got a very whiny pod dog underneath. I've got my mother's dog, and she is whining. She is bored because she thinks me sitting here talking to you is boring. So I'm off to give her a cuddle. And I love to hear from you. So do send me an email, corinnaharrod@gmail.com, or you can find me on social media, TikTok, Instagram. All the links and stuff are below. I'll put all the links to the sources below. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.